Do you remember the love generation? Maybe you were one of them. Everywhere you looked, groovy chicks were dancing. And we got ourselves in a twist. And some men wanted to be James Bond. Remember the exotic Playboy Club, where you could find girls doing the bunny dip? How we danced and sang to the music of four lads from Liverpool. Though some of us preferred that other group. And how, along with a new sexual freedom, we also found our political voice. Relive the day Charles was made Prince of Wales. The day we cheered Bobby Moore, brandishing the World Cup in triumph. And the whole world celebrated the first man on the moon, the perfect end to the decade we called the swinging 60s. As the decade opened, there was little hint of what lay ahead. The Lord Mayor's show in London's West End reminded us that tradition still ruled. But that was all about to change. We remember this decade as a time when staid old Britain began to peel away its modest, respectable veneer, when a new generation of sun worshippers and pleasure seekers began to take over. A sunny optimism permeated everything. We began to express ourselves in new and different ways. It was the permissive age, when women wanted to experiment with the way they looked. And where men grew their hair, threw away their suits, and dressed instead like court jesters, among other things. And most memorable of all was the Summer of Love in 1967. The lights of Piccadilly attracted a rootless tribe of modern gypsies. They called themselves hippies, and they slept rough in London parks, waiting for the dawn to break on Eros, their tribal god. The pagan god of sexual love, whose statue in Piccadilly Circus would become their shrine. They were the first generation with no memory of war, and they'd been brought up to choose their own path, and they chose the path of protest and personal freedom.
I grew up and looked around me and I saw that the world was in a mess. Thousands of hungry people, children starving, wars, injustice, and everybody kept picking on me. So I gotta get to the world off my back. Oh, pretty soon I'm gonna crack. So I gotta get to the world off my back.
As the decade progressed, the hippie style, even as it became more and more ostentatious, would join the mainstream. They were the most recognizable and influential of all the 60s tribes. They were called the Love Children and the Flower People. They were interested in mysticism, sometimes chemically induced, and they practiced astrology and free love. It seemed as if they'd dropped out of society and were dreaming only of peace and love. Their political affiliations would be passionately expressed later in the decade, as opposition to the war in Vietnam reached its peak. But where did this march away from conformity come from? Perhaps it was a result of the Cold War, that standoff between East and West. We were now abandoning national service, which had been compulsory since World War I. There, young men had been taught discipline and the art of combat. Now young people were free to do what they wanted. It became plain that a third world war, if it happened, would be very different. There'd be no need for regiments of young soldiers, when rocket-propelled missiles and jet planes with atomic warheads could wipe out an entire city in minutes. And after World War II, we joined the Nuclear Bomb Club to help keep the peace. But it made us one of the first targets in any nuclear war.
21 years ago, the H-bomb was unheard of. Today, the bravest pilots would avail us little, so at least believe the anti-nuclear thousands up and down the country. They say that unless Britain leads the world in banning the bomb, atomic war will be inevitable, and then the whole human race will be destroyed.
A new generation of peace protesters was born. The Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, or CND.
Sheila Delaney and fellow playwright John Osborne. There too was the author Sir Herbert Reed. They followed the tactics Gandhi made popular in India, passive resistance. The movement will grow, believes Sheila Delaney. Support comes from some of the churches and is not confined to young people. On this occasion, the police were instructed to show no force, and complaints against them were few.
Many of the teenagers who witnessed the famous Trafalgar Square sit-in would become leaders of the Make Love Not War movement that lay in wait for us just a few years later. The peace movement began to gather momentum when the Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man to venture into outer space. Our ally in World War II was now the greatest threat to world peace. When Gagarin returned in triumph to Moscow and a bear hug from Premier Khrushchev, it was clear that the Soviets were winning the space race, maybe the arms race too. The young President John Kennedy needed to hold his nerve when Khrushchev threatened to launch missiles at the USA from Cuba, a mere 80 miles away.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Kennedy ordered planes to intercept Russian ships that were carrying nuclear missiles to Cuba, whose president, Fidel Castro, was closely allied with Soviet Russia. A head-on collision with appalling consequences seemed certain. In Britain, our government backed Kennedy's gamble after spending all night at an emergency cabinet meeting. When the ministers emerged, they found their way blocked by CND protesters using their sit-in technique. They were becoming expert at it, and so were the police at moving them on. Then, at the UN Assembly, Khrushchev announced that he was pulling his missiles out. He had blinked first, and Kennedy had triumphed. Just a year later, his future bright with promise, John Kennedy was visiting Dallas, Texas.
From a high window rings out the shot that changes American history. Confusion is indescribable. Both the President and Governor Connolly are hit. While they are rushed to hospitals, swarms of police and FBI men search for the assassin. Police now have the murder gun. On it, they say, a palm print of the man under arrest.
But his assassin, Lee Oswald, would not live to stand trial. It was the so-called shot that was heard around the world, and in an unforgettable image of this era, his son John saluted his dead father as he passed by. And back home we saluted one of our greatest leaders, Winston Churchill. His death in 1965 came gently in his sleep. He was 90. At the Queen's request, he was honoured with a state funeral. Churchill had lived just long enough to see his Conservative Party beaten in the '64 election. They've had a long innings, he growled, and it's probably time for a change. Enough people felt the same way and brought Labour back to power for the first time in 13 years, although they won by only a handful of seats. Many were unhappy about Labour's return to power, and in the melee at Trafalgar Square, as the results came in, there were some passionate exchanges of opinion.
Disaster abroad! Since nationalisation is almost certain, I don't like it. I'm very disappointed in the British public.
Labour supporters, of course, argued that the Conservatives had changed very little.
The Conservatives have done nothing since they've been in.
I think we're at long last going to get some planning into the economy. We're going to get more control.
What do you predict for Britain under the Socialists?
A change from mediocrity over 13 years.
Maybe it was this night in Trafalgar Square that confirmed the feelings of many that this country was on the verge of radical change.